following report was made over 2 days and explores the activist Bernie Sanders used to be and the politician he would later become. This is Bernie Sanders, radical activist, mainstream politician. With people terrified of the prospect of a Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump general election presidential race, there seems to be some echoing on the center left that Bernie Sanders is the one liberal revolutionary, a contradiction in terms, that can save us all. That he is the one person who can bring change to the masses and give us a country that meets our needs. But to gain perspective, I wanted to illustrate what kinds of beliefs that Bernie Sanders seemingly held as a young activist, what revolutionary he could have been as a politician, and the politician that he became. I will note that my skepticism for Sanders, despite my tepid support of him, is large, and that in many instances I cannot trust him to be a revolutionary, which is why I have been advocating we get on the ground and fight for a social revolution from the bottom up. We have to institute it with public pressure, regardless of who becomes the president. But I wanted to reach out to hardcore Sanders supporters here about the activist Bernie Sanders was before he became a politician, and whether or not it can actually more strongly reflect views that you hold, or whether you just think the views that he seemingly used to hold is crazy, and we will explore the motivations behind the unaddressed shift to moderation. So let's begin. Presently, one of Sanders' many problems with the current political establishment is the collusion of the corporate media and the political elite. He was keenly aware of this when he wrote an essay on February 13th, 1979 for the Vermont Vanguard Press titled Social Control and the Tube. And in this instance, he did not shy away from radical changes to the capitalist structure of the television industry. Now, you'll hardly hear about that, but in the essay, he argues, quote, like many other aspects of capitalist society, there is a fundamental contradiction in the television industry. The owners of the television industry very consciously do not want to use that potentially extraordinary medium to educate people, to uplift people, or to improve the quality of life in our society. To do so would be to act against their own best interest. What the owners of the TV industry want to do, and are doing in my opinion, is use that medium to intentionally brainwash people into submission and helplessness. With considerable forethought, they are attempting to create a nation of morons who will faithfully go out and buy this or that product, vote for this or that candidate, and faithfully work for their employers for as low a wage as possible. Sanders' most ardent supporters, who have no previous experience with the term democratic socialism outside of Sanders' use and see it merely as a synonym for the capitalist economy alongside a welfare state will have never heard this side of Bernie Sanders before, or the concept of socialism, which advocates for worker control over the means of production. Sanders argues for such a change in the means of production in the conclusion of his essay. Quote, "The potential of television, democratically owned and controlled by the people, is literally beyond comprehension because it is such a relatively new medium, and we have no experience with it under democratic control. At the least, with the present state of technology, we could have a choice of dozens of channels of commercial-free TV. At the moment, serious writers are, by and large, not allowed to write for commercial television, for fear they might produce something that is true, and hence upset the owners of the media. Under democratic control, people with all kinds of views could make their presentations, and serious artists would be encouraged to produce work for the tube. There is no question that television has an enormous impact upon our society, and that the controllers of the medium have more power than almost any politician. For those of us who are concerned about living in a democratic and healthy society, it is necessary to address the control of television as a political issue and organize to win." End quote. Sanders' most devoted supporters who purport to believe in everything he stands for and started calling themselves a democratic socialist will have to admit that he would not come forward with this kind of forceful language in today's political climate. Why? I'm not sure. Is it more important for him to win than to advocate for something that he actually believes in? Did he get tired of being worn down by a political establishment since he was mayor of Burlington starting in 1981? Did he change his mind about his radical beliefs and never quite address them because he was around people who were more liberal than radical? I don't know. But for those Sanders supporters who believe even everything he purports to stand for and call themselves a socialist or a democratic socialist and think that what Sanders is talking about now is the apex of political change, the most radical he could have possibly been, they do not factor in this essay. They do not factor in these beliefs. They do not address them. They do not think that they are important. They do not worry about them. And Sanders evidently does not worry about them. He does not address them. It is more politically expedient for him to simply pretend that democratic socialism means anything that is synonymous with the welfare state of Scandinavia. Now, that is simply not true, and he knows it isn't true, but he seems to not care because it is resonating. And if he has changed his political beliefs to not address democratic control of the means of production, which is what socialism actually is, in this article he is calling for the democratic control of the television industry by the producers of the television industry. That would be a socialist institution. Universal health care would be an example of the welfare state. Senator Sanders, if you have actually changed your opinion on this, I would like to hear it from you. If you haven't and you still believe in these fundamental principles, I would like to hear you say that you still believe in them and that kind of change will come later. If you do not address this and you pretend that democratic socialism is synonymous with reformed capitalism, I know by this article that you wrote that you would be simply lying. There are many instances of Sanders since he began his presidential run, and even before, since he's been in the Senate, to address what he allegedly means when he says democratic socialism. And evidently, they are much more benign than the ideas that he put forth in the aforementioned essay. Take a look.
If you look at countries throughout Europe, especially in Scandinavia, you find that healthcare is a right of all of their people. And in fact, they do it in a lot more cost-effective way. There is no great debate about the cost of college education in those countries because by and large, college education is free. You have in all of those countries workers having significant benefits in terms of pay, vacation time, and medical leave. You have very strong childcare systems in all of those countries. And by the way, in most of those countries, the voter turnout is a lot higher than it is in the United States, and they have pretty vigorous democracies. So what democratic socialism means to me is creating a government and policies that work for ordinary people, rather where our political system is dominated by large campaign donors who are working for the very wealthy.
What democratic socialism is about is saying that it is immoral and wrong that the top 1/10 of 1% in this country own almost 90%, own almost as much wealth as the bottom 90%. That it is wrong today in a rigged economy that 57% of all new income is going to the top 1%. That when you look around the world, you see every other major country providing health care to all people as a right, except the United States. You see every other major country saying to moms that when you have a baby, we're not going to separate you from your newborn baby because we are going to have medical and family paid leave like every other country on earth. Those are some of the principles that I believe in. So let me take this opportunity to define for you, simply and straightforwardly, what democratic socialism means to me. It means building on what Franklin Delano Roosevelt said when he fought for guaranteed economic rights for all Americans. And it builds on what Martin Luther King Jr. said in 1968 when he stated, and I quote, "This country has socialism for the rich and rugged individualism for the poor," end of quote. My view of democratic socialism builds on the success of many other countries around the world who have done a far better job than we have in protecting the needs of their working families, their elderly citizens, their children, their sick, and their poor. Democratic socialism means that we must reform a political system which is corrupt, that we must create an economy that works for all, not just the very wealthy. Among many other things, it means that health care should be a right of all people, not a privilege. Public education must today allow every person in this country who has the ability, the qualifications, and the desire, the right to go to a public college or university tuition-free. Democratic socialism means that our government does everything it can to create a full employment economy. It makes far more sense to me to put millions of people back to work rebuilding our crumbling infrastructure than to have a real unemployment rate of almost 10%. Democratic socialism means that if somebody works 40 hours a week, that person should not be living in poverty, that we must raise the minimum wage to a living wage, $15 an hour over the next several years. Democratic socialism, to me, means that we have government policy, strong government policy, which does not allow the greed and profiteering of the fossil fuel industry to destroy our environment and our planet. The wealthiest people and the largest corporations must pay their fair share of taxes. Democratic socialism, to me, does not just mean that we must create a nation of economic and social justice and environmental sanity. Of course, it does mean that. But it also means that we must create a vibrant democracy based on the principle of one person, one vote.
Do you know what would be a vibrant democracy based on the principle of one person, one vote? A society in which the workers control the means of production. Almost everything that Sanders lays out there is a repackaging of liberal reforms. He presents them as if these are both revolutionary and the apex of political change and common sense at the same time. He says these reforms are democratic socialism in order to make them sound more revolutionary than they actually are. He actually went on in that speech towards the end to say, I don't believe the government should take over the grocery store down the street or own the means of production, as if to suggest that under socialism or communism, the government would be the same neoliberal globalist superpower just taking over businesses and becoming our boss, instead of any government being controlled exclusively by the working class, since the working and the owner class would be dissolved into one and classes would cease to exist. Now, whether a socialist or a communist wants there to be a state at all is an open question, but it is a question that Sanders does not want to have because he wants to go on pretending and pandering to the ignorance of the voter by suggesting that socialism is anything a government does and anything someone's taxes pay for, regardless of how much control that the public has over its use. In addition to Sanders's misrepresentation of socialism, his presentation as an anti-war candidate is a huge misnomer. He supported many foreign interventions, including the war in Afghanistan, troops in Yugoslavia and Kosovo. He funded the F-35 fighter jet. He supports Obama's drone program and plans to keep his so-called kill list when he becomes president. He is not a non-interventionist. He does support imperialism, and in fact, the F-35 is one of the most profitable things to come to his state of Vermont, which he fought for because it was his home state. The point is that he is not a peace candidate that people are portraying him as, especially since even though he didn't vote to authorize the use of force or the Iraq War, he still voted to fund the at war, which means that he, in some sense, condoned it. He supports, to some extent, the Israeli occupation in Gaza, and in a sense like that, he supports, to some degree, apartheid. Now, since just because he is the most liberal supporter of Zionism does not excuse his support for it, nor does the fact that just because he may be a lesser degree of warmonger does not mean he's not a warmonger. His voting record now and his beliefs now did not have to be the Bernie Sanders who ended up running for president. In 1979, he made a documentary on Eugene V. Debs, whose views on the means of production and on imperialism were starkly different than the ones Sanders purports to believe now, even though the documentary was in support of Debs. Take a look.
It is very probable, especially if you are a young person, that you have never heard of Eugene Victor Debs. If you are the average American who watches television 40 hours a week, you have probably heard of such important people as Kojak and Wonder Woman, have heard about dozens of different kinds of underarm spray deodorants, every hack politician in your state, and the latest game between the Boston Red Sox and the New York Yankees. Strangely enough, however, nobody has told you about Gene Debs, one of the most important Americans of the 20th century. Why? Why haven't they told you about Gene Debs and the ideas he fought for? The answer is simple. More than a half century after his death, the handful of people who own and control this country, including the mass media and the educational system, still regard Debs and his ideas as dangerous, as a threat to their stability and class rule, and as someone best forgotten about. When American workers needed a radical independent political party to stand up to the Democratic and Republican parties which represented the interests of the capitalist class, Debs was there. He helped found the Socialist Party and ran for president on its ticket 5 times. On numerous occasions, he put his life on the line by speaking out against the imperialist slaughter taking place in Europe.
In September 1918, when the court was about to sentence him to his jail sentence for opposing World War I, the 63-year-old Debs fixed his eyes upon the presiding judge and spoke his philosophy of life.
Your Honor, years ago I recognized my kinship with all living things, and I made up my mind that I was not one bit better than the meanest on earth. I said then and I say now that while there is a lower class, I am in it. While there is a criminal element, I am of it. And while there is a soul in prison, I am not free.
Eugene Debs was a man who had a vision that life on this planet could be something of beauty, joy, and cooperation. He refused to believe that the suffering that he saw all about him, the poverty, ignorance, war, and exploitation, was caused by God or nature.
He believed rather that much of human suffering was caused by an irrational and cruel economic system, capitalism, which functioned not to improve the quality of life for all the people, but simply to enrich the bank accounts of the few who owned and controlled the economy. Men such as John D. Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan. And Debs believed that there could be no fundamental solutions to the problems facing the vast majority of the people unless the capitalist system was overthrown and replaced by a socialist economy in which the working people took over the means of production and worked for themselves rather than for a boss.
Why should working people support the Socialist Party? Because it is the only party unequivocally committed to their economic interests, to the abolition of the wage system, and the freedom of the worker from exploitation and every other species of servitude. Let no one charge that socialists have arrayed class against class in this struggle. That has been done long since in the evolution of capitalist society. One class now owns the tools while another class uses them. One class is small and rich, and the other large and poor. One wants more profit, and the other more wages. One consists of capitalists, and the other of workers. There can be no peace and goodwill between these essentially antagonistic economic classes, nor can the class conflict be covered up or smoothed over. The workers know that under Republican rule and Democratic rule, conditions for them have remained unchanged. They know that under the administration of both, depressions come, that unemployment is certain, and that many of their number are doomed to drift into poverty and crime, and finally end their lives as beggars, suicides, in prison cells, or on the scaffold. They know, too, that under both Democrat and Republican rule, the president is on the side of the capitalists, that the governors are all on the side of the capitalists, that Congress and all the state legislators respond to the demands of the capitalists, that the courts are uniformly with the capitalists, while soldiers and injunctions and jails are for the exclusive benefit of the workers. In capitalist society, the working man is not, in fact, considered a man at all, but as a wage worker is bought and sold on the open market, the same as hair, hide, salt, or any other merchandise. In capitalist society, the owner can pay a worker as low a wage as he can get away with, and then fire him the first day that he can no longer make a profit off of his labor. Is that what freedom is about? Or is that what slavery is about? Wage slavery. You as workers do not need the capitalist. He could not exist an instant without you. You would just begin to live without him. You do everything, and he has everything. And some of you imagine that if it were not for him, you would have no work. As a matter of fact, he does not employ you at all. You employ him to take from you what you produce, and he faithfully sticks to his task. If you can stand it, he can. And if you don't change this relation, I'm sure he won't. We need in this country and throughout the world an economic system in which the working people own the means of production, and in which we produce goods and services for the use of all, and not for the profit of the few. Under socialism, men and women will work not as slaves as they do today, but as free human beings, determining what is produced and how it is produced, and will take satisfaction and pride in their work, knowing that they and their children will be the beneficiaries of their labor, and not some capitalist parasite who has a piece of paper declaring himself to be the owner, although he may never have done a productive day's work in his life. The workers are the saviors of society, the redeemers of the human race. And when they have fulfilled their great historic mission and have overthrown the capitalist system, men and women can walk the highlands and enjoy the vision of a land without masters and without slaves, a land regenerated and resplendent in the triumph of freedom and civilization.
Over the years, he gradually developed the belief, which he maintained for the rest of his life, that workers could not be successful in fighting their employers if they were organized into small, ineffectual craft unions. Unions which often spent more time and energy competing against each other than in opposing their employers. If industrial unionism could bring greater benefits to workers in the railroad industry, then it could do the same for workers in factories and mines across the country. For the people who owned America, it was clear that the ARU was a dangerous example which had to be stamped out before the idea of industrial unionism could spread. And with the help of the President of the United States, the federal court system, the militia, and the newspapers, it was.
3 weeks after the strike had begun, it was lost. The American Railway Union virtually annihilated, and Gene Debs with other union leaders were sent to jail in Woodstock, Illinois, for defying the injunction. In September of 1915, Gene Debs gave his views of the war then raging in Europe.
I am not a capitalist soldier. I am a proletarian revolutionist. I am opposed to every war but one. I am for that war with heart and soul,
and that is the worldwide war of the social revolution. In that war, I am prepared to fight in any way the ruling class may make necessary, even to the barricades. That is where I stand and where I believe the Socialist Party stands or ought to stand on the question of war. In the Middle Ages, the feudal lords and barons, the economic predecessors of the capitalists of our day, declared all wars, and their miserable serfs fought all the battles. The poor, ignorant serfs had been taught to revere their masters, to believe that when their masters declared war upon one another, it was their patriotic duty to fall upon each other and to cut one another's throats for the profit and glory of the lords and barons who held them in contempt. And that is war in a nutshell. It hasn't changed. The master class has always declared the wars. The subject class has always fought the battles. The master class has had all to gain and nothing to lose, while the subject class has had nothing to gain and all to lose, especially their lives. The ruling class has always taught and trained you to believe it to be your patriotic duty to go to war and to have yourself slaughtered at their command. But in all the history of the world, you, the people, have never had a voice in declaring war. And strange as it certainly appears, no war by any nation in any age has ever been declared by the people. And here let me emphasize the fact, and it cannot be repeated too often, that the working class who fight all the battles, the working class who make the supreme sacrifices, the working class who freely shed their blood and furnish the corpses, have never yet had a voice in either declaring war or making peace. It is the ruling class that invariably does both. They alone declare war, and they alone make peace. Yours not to reason why, yours but to do or die. This is their motto, and we object on the part of the awakening workers of this nation.
2 weeks after he gave his Canton, Ohio speech, Gene Debs was arrested and charged with violating the Espionage Act. 2 months later, he was tried, found guilty of the charges, and sentenced to 10 years in prison.
The little that I am hoping to be, I owe to the socialist movement. It has given me my ideas and ideals, my principles and convictions, and I would not exchange one of them for all of Rockefeller's blood-stained dollars. It has taught me how to serve, a lesson to me of priceless value. It has taught me the ecstasy in the handclasp of a comrade. It has enabled me to hold high communion with you and made it possible for me to take my place side by side with you in the great struggle for the better day, to multiply myself over and over again, to thrill with a fresh-born manhood, to feel life truly worthwhile, to open new avenues of vision, to spread out glorious vistas, to know that I am kin to all that throbs, to be class conscious, and to realize that regardless of nationality, race, creed, color, or sex, every man, every woman who toils, who renders useful service, every member of the working class without exception is my comrade, my brother and sister, and that to serve them in their cause is the highest duty of my life.
All the Eugene Debs quotes heard in the documentary were read by Bernie Sanders, and the other narrators of the documentary spoke about Debs in glowing terms. This documentary could be read as nothing other than an endorsement of Debs and his beliefs, and the belief that workers should be in charge of the means of production, and that all war is unjust because the people have no say in the war, and that the only war that really is just is one in which the people fight the ruling class, which may prove to be necessary. The point is that a belief in liberal reformism that Bernie Sanders seems to hold is democratic socialism is not genuinely democratic socialism, first of all. And we know that he knows that it isn't. but it is politically convenient to phrase it as such. And to call one form of workers' control over the means of production socialism, and to call welfare capitalism democratic socialism, would be to suggest that socialism is undemocratic. To say one form is socialism and another form is democratic socialism, when it's not actually socialism, is to suggest that actual socialism, in its most basic form, workers' control over the means of production, would be undemocratic. And the only way to make socialism democratic would be to make it so it's not actually socialism at all. No, this is clearly bullshit. But I would take the advocating of worker cooperatives, worker-owned businesses, to be spread out, to be fought for. But not even that is being fought for since Bernie started his presidential campaign. All that's being fought for are government reforms under a capitalist economy. There is no effort to restructure the economy, and there is no effort on Sanders' part to fight imperialism, because one of his most profitable ventures in his home state is the F-35 fighter jet made by Lockheed Martin, who is a massive war profiteer. So where are the things that would actually fundamentally change the structure of the economy? Where is actual socialism and the precise actual definition that democratic socialism would entail? Where has this been since he started his campaign?
We need to develop new economic models to increase job creation and productivity. Instead of giving huge tax breaks to corporations which ship our jobs to China and other low-wage countries, we need to provide assistance to workers who want to purchase their own businesses by establishing worker-owned cooperatives.
Especially in the midst of a recession, where unemployment is so high, where people are really worried about outsourcing, employee ownership, the capability of people to own the places in which they work, means that those companies are not going to be running to China. Morale in those companies are higher because people are actually participating in the democratic decision-making process. So I think this is a great idea. It has been for many years. Vermont and Ohio are leaders in this area. We've introduced 2 bills that would, I think, greatly expand the concept of employee ownership. We're going to work hard to see get those bills passed.
When we talk about democracy, it means more, in my view, and I think in your view, than people just having the right to vote once every 4 years or once every 2 years, or maybe make a phone call without the government knowing who they're calling. But democracy is more than that. Democracy basically means, to as great a degree as possible, not just politically, but economically as well, giving people control over their own lives. And very few people talk about it, which is why the work that you do is so important. What you are saying is that people should have some control over their work life as well as their political life. That when somebody gets to work in the morning, they should have some say about how that work is arranged and how that company functions. And when we do that, we make people much stronger. We make people feel much better about themselves than simply being a cog in the machine. This morning, throughout America, millions of people woke up and they said, "Oh God, I have to go to work. I have to go to work in order to earn a check, in order to take care of my family. I have got, maybe to get some health insurance, I have got to go to work." What a drag. On the other hand, there are people who wake up this morning and say, wow, I'm going to work. It's exciting. Think about the things we're doing, what we're producing, the way we're doing it. I'm really excited about working in A, B, or C place. So a democracy, to my mind, and I think to your mind, is figuring out ways that we can give people more impact in the work that they are doing, help them make the decisions that companies make. And we know the results of that are not only good for people, they are good for the bottom line of companies. People are not going to be absent, not going to take unnecessary sick leave when they're excited about the work they're doing. Productivity goes up, absenteeism goes down.
Where was that? He started his campaign more than a year ago, and since starting his campaign, he has not spoken one word about employee-owned cooperatives. Now, to be fair, in these clips, he was not talking about an industry-wide takeover by the working class. That would be more widespread socialism instead of pockets of it. But you also notice that during these remarks, he never once said the word socialism. And during his remarks about the welfare state, he used the term democratic socialism all the time. He's got his priorities mixed up here. Now, there is nothing inherently wrong with public services, but they are not unique to socialism in any form. Employee ownership is unique to socialism, and in order for industry to be democratically owned as a whole, that would require a socialist takeover. Bernie wasn't arguing for a socialist takeover, but at least he argued for policies that have some semblance of socialism in those two clips, which he has not argued for once in the entire duration of his presidential campaign, and he hardly talks about during his congressional and senatorial careers. You would think that a democratic socialist would talk more about the economic models needed to make that reality come to fruition, but not Sanders. Those are two isolated instances of his congressional and senatorial career in which he talked about worker ownership of the means of production, which he hardly ever did. And even then, he wasn't talking about the means of production as a whole. He was talking about individual businesses. But you won't hear him talk about that because he seems to have sacrificed his radicalism in favor of political expediency in order to get along with some of the more liberal or progressive people in the Democratic caucus, which he joined in order to have some allyship in the congressional and senatorial seats that he held. But the point is, to proclaim that Sanders never was a radical is partially inaccurate, but to proclaim that he's fighting for socialism now is wholly inaccurate, and to claim that he's fighting for an anti-imperialist agenda when some of his votes included funding the war for Iraq, voting for the war in Afghanistan, and voting for intervention in Kosovo and the funding of the F-35 fighter jet. He is not in any sense an anti-war candidate or a socialist candidate. In order to do that, he would have to fight for workers' control over the means of production. And those are two of the only instances where I can see that he's fought for anything close, and none of them have been spoken of during his presidential campaign. I am trying to bring these issues to light to say that if you really want workers to have ultimate control over their lives, then voting for Sanders would not be the only course of action, or even any course of action. And for those of you who want not to vote for Sanders, I understand. It would not be appropriate to assume that socialism, democratic socialism or otherwise, will happen under Sanders. Only a slightly more expanded version and of liberalism. But he won't talk about that because it is good for his brand to pretend that he is fighting for democratic socialism now and always has been. But he's clearly changed his rhetoric on certain issues because his role model went from Eugene V. Debs to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And that is the problem. That for a politician who claims to be so consistent and so in favor of peace and so in favor of the working class, he is suddenly faded from that discussion since beginning his national political career. And that is the problem with a candidate who claims to fight for socialism, and he can only fight for some benign reforms. He only thinks that that is the best he can do, or he changes opinion without these remarks and his Debs documentary and his essay arguing for democratic control of the media. A vision that this channel shares, going unaddressed. They can't go unaddressed. They cannot be ignored, and they cannot stop being fought for, even if Bernie Sanders has portrayed us on that front. I'm Jeremy Einbinder for Democratize the Media, making a media that works for everyone and fighting for workers' control everywhere. Thanks for watching.